Today we're here with Lara Swan from CV who's going to give us a presentation on how to stand out when you do a CV and covering letter. We've got a lot of people here today, so I just wanted to talk to people who may not be members of the SOE, just to tell them a little bit about the SOE and what we do. So the SOE is the Society of Operations Engineers. We are here to, we exist to promote safety and sustainable engineering. And we also want to recognise and enhance the careers of engineers. So we represent engineers from all different backgrounds. We've got several different sectors, one being road transport engineers, plant engineers, which is manufacturing and maintenance engineers, insurance and inspection engineers, and we also have representation from environmental engineering as well. We like to help engineers at all walks of life and at all stages of their careers, which is why we're doing this today. So we have student and apprenticeship membership, which is actually free. And we have membership for members and higher grades as well, for those who are maybe more distinguished or later in their career. So we cover a vast area of engineering, and we have a many different types of engineers from various different backgrounds. For the time being, it's over to Lara. So, Lara, thank you, and away you go.
Thank you for the introduction, and first of all, thank you all for joining me today. A big welcome from my living room here in Wales. It's not quite the same not being able to see you, but hopefully we'll be able to cover the content, and if you do have any questions at the end, I'm more than happy to answer them, so feel free to pop them in the chat box along the way. Otherwise, I'll just get started. So big thank you to the SOE for inviting me, and as I said, the purpose of this webinar is to really help you stand out from the crowd and help you put your best foot forward in the job market. As we know, it's always a competitive place to be, but I think over the last year or so, it's at the forefront of a lot of people's mind as to how we do stand out. So CV and More, as a business, what we do is we are CV experts. So we write CVs and cover letters, train people on interviews and such like. And also we do recruitment as well. So I'm their talent acquisition manager, and I've seen thousands of CVs. So I've got a really good understanding of what good looks like. And also how CVs differ from person to person and from sector to sector. So hopefully I'll be able to impart some of that wisdom for you today. So if we could just move on to the first slide, please. Thank you very much. So the word CV, curriculum vitae, that's the Latin, not to get into too much of a lecture, but what it means is it means the course of my life. And then you might hear it as a resume as well, and that means a summary. So really, it gives employers enough information about you in order to make a measured decision. So that will be whether they want to invite you to an interview, perhaps to a working assessment, depending on the type of work you're doing, or even in some situations, hire you straight away, which would be a lovely scenario if they were all like that. But really the purpose of the document is to give people enough information to know whether they want to move you forward to the next stage in whatever process they might have. So the CV itself is really as close to a legal document as you can get. So what that tells us is that we need to be factual. We of course need to be positive about ourselves, but making sure we're really balancing that line, making sure it's a really genuine, truthful and accurate reflection of yourself. And so I think something that's shocked me when I heard it, and is always important to know, that the average time that someone spends reading your CV, whether they're a hiring manager or a recruiter, is only 6 seconds long. So that's really not long at all. So we need to make sure that within this document, within our CV and also our cover letter, which we'll cover later on in the session, that we're pulling out the right information and making sure that we put our best foot forward, because we really do need to maximize that time that we have with the reader to make sure that the right skills are standing out and you give yourself the best chance of putting your best foot forward. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm introducing a case study here for the purpose of helping you understand how to get the right message across with your CV, and a couple of takeaways that we're going to get from looking at the Google logo in particular to help maybe contextualize what I'm talking about today. So the logo was designed, this is a little bit of a more modern version. I don't know if any of you, a quick Google away, but if anyone remembers the more classic design and the classic typeface. But this was designed right at the start of Google's kind of life journey. We know now that they're the world's biggest search engine and one of the most recognizable brands that there are around. But I just want to talk to you about where this began. So it was designed initially by a woman called Ruth Kadar. She's an architect and a designer. She was very early on in her career when she was pitching for the commission to work with Google. And so the reason she believes that Google selected her for the commission was because she genuinely listened to them and she matched what they were looking for. So a bit of background on the logo itself. So the reason she said she designed it in such a way was because you have the white background, which makes the logo, of course, stand out. The primary colors, which were in line with Google's design itself. She visited the office. She said at the time there were lots of lava lamps, lots of bright colors around. So she used that. And then alongside that, she used a more traditional typeface as a way to kind of, in her words, marry the traditional kind of view of a company, traditional searching methods with the more modern approach, which was, of course, turning it into an online search engine, which was very new at the time. So, what do we learn from the Google logo? The reason I'm talking to you about this is because Ruth got the commission and we recognise this logo over time because she listened and reflected to exactly what was asked of her. She wouldn't have got the commission, which for our purposes, the interview or the job, if she didn't match that directly. She also is very clear about what stands out. So visually, with our 6 seconds, we need to make sure that we're pulling out the right information and making sure that you stand out yourself. It's also an interesting lesson on being brave in your ability, which is always key with a job search. We don't want to put ourselves off from applying to something or trying something just because we're not quite sure if we have the experience or if we're early on in our career, perhaps if that's you. But the main takeaway, I believe, which should be helpful for us, is that this is such a recognizable logo that has been developed over a period of time that in the context of a CV, if we put the work in early on and we create a solid base, a solid foundation that we can use, it will serve us so well across the course of our working life. So it's a really, really good example of how we can think about how to match our skills with what's being asked of us, first off, and how we can help ourselves in the course of our career by putting in the work now. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before I get on to the kind of core content, if you will, around the job responsibilities and your skill sets in regards to the day-to-day, I'm going to talk to you about what I would call the kind of introductory section to your CV. So the first point would be our personal profile. It can also be known as a professional overview or a professional profile. I wouldn't deviate too far outside of that wording, and using me as an example, if I were to put Lara's experience, that wouldn't necessarily be the most appropriate in this context. So just make sure we keep an eye on that title we're using there. But the purpose of this profile is a brief summary. So we need to include a little bit of information on our current situation. So what you're doing at the moment, be it in employment, be it in a different sector, studying, what have you, we add that information to it. We include some information around what you're looking for. And what I mean by that is matching that to the job you're applying for. We need to highlight the relevant information, the skills that you have that will be appropriate to this job. So that's your personal profile, a couple of sentences long, not too much of an essay, but a good punchy start to a CV to allow the reader in those 6 seconds to say, okay, that's the first part ticked off. I can see those key skills and the motivation. Education and qualifications would be the next part to a CV. Always include your dates, and I think the amount of information around your education that you're giving. So, for example, that would be modules, maybe courses that you've attended over a period of time. Make sure we pull out information there that are going to be relevant to our audience. Is there a particular module that would be transferable to a role that you're applying for, be it directly or perhaps when it comes to the skill set that you gained that you could add to that next company that you're joining? Make sure we're keeping these relevant, and the amount of information definitely depends on where we are in the course of our career. And the next section would be your key skills. One of the most important elements of a CV, which we'll see throughout this presentation, will be the use of CVs and making sure we're drawing the reader's eye to the right place. We need to match them directly to the role that you're recruiting, or that you're applying for rather. So we need to make sure that if you're in a certain field of engineering and you're looking to apply for a role within that sector, or perhaps something where we're aiming to transfer a skill set over, we're thinking about the application and what they're looking for, and making sure that we're matching these key skills to that. Don't worry too much if you haven't done a job specifically, but think about that transferability piece and make sure that throughout these sections and throughout all of your CV and your cover letter included, that we're using positive keywords. So thinking about things that describe your ability as a professional, but also describe you as a person, which will add a lot of value to your application. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about the main content in your CV. So this is the bulk that's going to give the hiring manager or the recruiter the real detail around your experience and what makes you the right person for the job. So sentences and tone, once again, we're going to draw on those positive keywords and words that we associate with the role itself and we associate with us as individuals. We're all different people, so make sure that we're not writing too generically and we're specifying that it's you. Prioritization. So by this, there's a couple of things that I need to mention here. CVs generally, we don't want to go further back than 10 years. So if you are slightly further on in your career, make sure that we're not using too much space on this CV to go too far back if we don't need to. Don't put your time in the wrong place. Focus on the recent past or your roles within the last 10 years. The order of your CV, of course, needs to be chronological. So that means your most recent role first. And also prioritization, I believe the most important aspect of this would be making sure that we're putting the relevant information in the right order. So we don't want a big bulk of text written in paragraphs. If we can, bullet point this information and put the most relevant information to the job application at the top of that list. So instead of starting perhaps with the use of Microsoft Word, which is potentially generic, could be seen on many CVs, think about the job you're applying for and the most important skills that you have for them and pop them to the top of the list. Links. So what I mean here is that it's a chance not only to save a little bit of space on your CV, but also to demonstrate further information that you might want the reader to go to. So first off, that would potentially be a portfolio of work that you've undertaken that you can link to the reader or the hiring manager. And also, of course, in the world that we live in, LinkedIn. And it really can be your best friend when it comes to making job applications and stepping forward in the job market. Can really make sure that if you have a good LinkedIn profile that you're proud of and you want to link on your profile, I absolutely would do that. So make sure you add a few hyperlinks as and when you can. Key achievements is perhaps one of the elements of a CV that is most commonly lacking, perhaps. So what I mean by this is it justifies why you're a strong candidate through demonstrating the work that you've done. So we've discussed that bullet point list, that overview and that understanding of your core responsibilities. But this is the point where you demonstrate your impact, the impact you've had on a team or what you've been able to accomplish. So for example, take me talking to you right now. If I was to write on my CV, hosted a webinar, there's a big difference between me saying hosted a webinar and me saying hosted a webinar for 200 people to the Society of Operations Engineers. I include the topic, I include information, and I include perhaps what you as the viewer of this got from it, but more importantly, it gives more information around that bullet point list, so to speak. So we're really adding kind of meat to the bones. And on this content piece, it's also important to flag the length of a CV. So it's probably one of the most common questions I get is, how long should my CV be? Is this too long? Some people, typically, there has been a bit of a view that 1 page is a good length and everything should be kind of added to that 1 page, but that's not necessarily true. I think if you're earlier on in your career, perhaps one, maybe just over 1 page would suffice. And then on the flip side of that, if you're falling over 3 pages, for example, because you can't get all the information in there, I potentially question how far back you're going with your career experience. Some of the formatting, potentially, is there a way for you to condense it? But also, are you prioritizing the right information? So is there a lot of information on your CV that in those 6 seconds aren't going to be relevant? So make sure we're bearing that in mind whilst we're discussing the content and what we're adding to our CV. Next slide, please, Oliver. Thank you. Applicant tracking software. So this is more and more common for businesses, for hiring managers to use. It saves a lot of time. And what it does, it's a system that's inputted by the user. So there will be keywords that are relative to a job that somebody is applying for. And these keywords will be used by the software to filter out candidates. So ultimately, what that means is you could be exactly the right person for the role that you're applying for. You could have all the skills. But if it's not on your CV, it will fall foul of an ATS style system. And it will use a Boolean search style technique to pull out those key skills. And it will be inputted directly as a result of what that client is looking for. So we need to think about how we get that information. So don't think that this is in any way going to trick you or these skills might be a surprise, because that's not the case. The skills that they are looking for will be very clear if you spend enough time looking at a job description, a job specification, if you will, and going through looking at their requirements and what they're looking for. So once again, we need to be really, really careful with our use of key skills. So we've mentioned them further back on the actual key skills section. We've mentioned them in our personal profile, our professional overview. We've mentioned them in the content, but we need to be mentioning them at least 3 times, if not more, in order to make sure that we're getting ourselves through this initial test. Because what we don't want to happen is for a software like this to dismiss you when you are the right person for the role. Also on this ATS piece, we need to make sure that you're submitting a CV as a Word document or a PDF. Anything outside of that potentially might not be admissible. And also be slightly careful of any graphics or designs that you're adding to a CV, because they may not necessarily be detected in the right way by this style of software. Next slide, please. Thank you. Formatting. So this is all about the visual side of our CV. So we've covered the content. We know there or thereabouts what we want to be adding at this point. But if we don't put it together in the right way, put it together in a professional way, we're not going to pass that 6-second rule. Once again, so think about where the reader's eye is going to be drawn when you're putting all this together. Colours typically, font will either be in a dark navy or a black. But like we saw with Ruth and her development of the Google logo, think about the company that you're applying for. If they're perhaps a more creative industry or a more creative style of business, or if you feel that it would be acceptable to add more color to your formatting, then absolutely do. But what I would say on that is just be careful and not to go too far when it comes to the formatting. Be wary of the ATS like we discussed. But also, we need to remember that the content should be speaking for itself. So don't make anything too busy, because we need to make sure that we're drawing the reader to the right place. And similarly with font, the classic professional fonts, of course, are going to be Arial, Times New Roman, etc. And also think about the size of the font as well. Anywhere between 10 and 12 is typically normal. So we don't want to be presenting a hiring manager with kind of Comic Sans size 15, because we want them to see you as a professional, to be clear, to be concise, and that doesn't necessarily hit that marker. So just be careful on that. What I would add on font, bold or emboldened words rather, can be a really, really helpful way to just add extra emphasis on those key skills. So just think about that when you're putting together your personal profile. The use of bold is not discouraged in any way. I personally would recommend it in order to make sure that during those 6 seconds, the eye is going to the right place. And then lastly, be consistent. So it's not uncommon when you're putting a CV together, or perhaps if we're developing a CV that we've had for a longer period of time, that they can potentially lose consistency throughout the document. So make sure that the formatting is all there and follows through, everything lines up, but also make sure you don't tail off, and make sure that you're projecting your professionalism. So be creative where relevant is our takeaway from here, but also balance that with that sense of professionalism that we're looking for. Next slide, please. Thank you. What might be missing? So at this point, we've covered our content, we've covered the initial structure. What we now need to consider are those extra points or those extra marks that we're looking for, really. So the first one I would always add would be any relevant computer systems or skills. So even if it's perhaps a bespoke system, which many of us will have come across working at a particular company, they've designed their own software, that's absolutely fine. It demonstrates a level of transferability. If you can get used to their system, maybe you can get used to mine. And on the systems and skills piece, when it comes to the kind of online usage, you don't have to be an expert. So don't worry if you're not. Take Excel, for example. You don't have to be developing kind of macros or anything like that. You can be a strong Excel user just by using on a day-to-day, being able to manipulate data and use formulae. So you don't have to be an expert. Don't put yourself off on that point. So just be wary of that. The next point in regards to what might be missing would be volunteering. So might not be relevant to all of you. If it isn't, that's not a problem at all. It's not going to disadvantage your application in any way. But volunteering is really key to add to your CV if it is relevant for you. It allows the reader to understand what's close to your heart, which I think gives an insight into your interests and your passions, which is always very important. We'll talk more about that in a second. But more and more so, companies are very, very aware of their social responsibility. So when hiring, if someone can offer that kind of interest in volunteering and perhaps it matches the company's interest in wanting to give back, it's always a good thing to note down. So don't forget that section on your CV, if of course it is relevant. And then my final point on what might be missing is arguably the most important when it comes to making your CV yours. Because I could sit here all day and talk about what a generically good CV looks like, but ultimately it's your CV. And so it's very important that when you're putting this information together, we come to the end of our CV, we've got all the professional information down there, but that's not necessarily enough to paint a picture about you. So an example I'd always use is one of the kind of key interests that's always seen on a CV would be travel and fitness. That's a very kind of normal example, and it wouldn't potentially mark you down, so to speak, if you were to add it. But what it doesn't do is tell me anything really about you. So we need to make sure that you're standing out. So even if it's a hobby that might seem day to day, make sure you add it on there, because you might not think that someone else would be interested in it, but what it does mean is set you apart from everybody else that's put travel and fitness at the bottom of their CV, although I'm sure most of us would probably want to be on holiday right now. Next slide, please, Oliver. Thank you. This part of our discussion here is all about maximizing the hard work you're doing, really. So what I mean by that is we've discussed key skills throughout this session, making sure that we're standing out, that we're putting the right information across. But we need to make sure that if we're on these platforms, so what I mean by platform would be a job board. So for yourselves, probably engineeringjobs.co.uk, and some of the larger job boards as well. You've got Reed, Monster, etc. If I'm a hiring manager or a recruiter and I'm using my Boolean search, I'm typing away, if you're not coming up in my search, I'm not going to find you, which is the harsh truth. And the harsh lesson that I have to teach you today, really, is that if we're not making the information clear enough, and if we are on those platforms, you're not going to be at the top of the pile, which is absolutely where you should be. And so there's no point doing all the hard work, putting all the graft and getting this all together, if we can't get you to the top of that list and make you as searchable as possible. Whether that's a word or not, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's perhaps the most apt one that I can use in this context. So really, we need to make sure that we're making our lives easier. And the searching principles also apply to LinkedIn as well. So be very wary of that too. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've gone through the CV now. We've taken a look at the content. We've taken a look at the introduction, how it should look, what steps we're doing to make ourselves stand out. The last stage, really, and most companies that are hiring will still want a cover letter, so it's still very, very relevant. We now need to make sure that in this cover letter, we're putting forward relevant information to that application. So where do you start with a cover letter? Is quite a common question that I get. So you really need to start by thinking about the purpose. So it's a summary style letter, essentially. So we're talking about why you're applying, what motivates you, and why you're the right person for that role. So there may be certain situations where you might not have experience in that field. For example, this is the chance for you to put forward the why, the transferability. Why am I making this step in my career? Why now? Why am I relevant for this role? So really think about the message that you're trying to put across here. You need to start with a thank you, first off, to the reader for taking the time to read your application. And then we need to introduce ourselves. And we need to keep the reader interested and keep them engaged with what you're saying, whilst making sure that this cover letter, once again, like we've spoken about before, is unique to you. The structure of a cover letter. So not many of us still actually write formal letters, but that's the aim of the game with a cover letter. We need to introduce in a formal way, be it sir, madam, the hiring manager's name, or whatever introduction you believe is relevant, whilst maintaining that kind of sense of formality. It needs a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion, like all good letters do. So think about that introduction, the why me, why I'm applying, what I can bring to it. And then we also need to maximize on all the hard work we've just done by signposting them to your CV. So we need to think about the key skills that you're pointing them towards. Any examples that you might allude to? Reflect it in your CV and direct them to your CV, because that's absolutely key. So the purpose of the cover letter overall is a big emphasis on the why. What motivates you? Why you're good for that role? Why you're applying? Perhaps if you're transferring that skill set, what's your motivation? Why now? And really focus on what makes you relevant for that role and what motivates you and what drives you for it, why you're applying. And your CV, which we've put together, should have everything that you need in it. So this is surplus to requirements, so to speak, but a chance for them to hear your voice and to hear your reasoning, which is really, really crucial. Next slide, please, Oliver. Fabulous. So we've made it to the end. So first of all, a big thank you to all of you for listening to me today. I put down a link there to a CV and more on social media. If you want to reach out to me directly, please do. It's Lara Swan. And we've also added a little discount code there for you at the bottom. So if you do reach out to us for any reason, quote that or quote that you've been on this webinar, and that should hopefully help you in some form too. But I really hope that I was able to kind of impart some advice there and you found this helpful. And what I'll do now, I'll just take a look at the chat box and see if we have any questions from everybody. Okay.
Yeah, Laura, thank you. That was really, really useful, and I'm sure everyone has benefited from it and been able to take something away. I've got one question actually before we start doing the Q&A. So the ATS software, where you should put your keywords and things like that, should that be aspirational keywords, what you're trying to achieve, or the words that they are, or words so recruiters will be looking for people as an engineer when they maybe want to recruit someone in a senior engineer role?
I think that's a really good question, because it's really important to put those positive keywords across for both of those parts of the question. So we need to be including the positive attributes about ourselves in that. But when it comes to the ATS software itself, because it's so robotic and specific, it's more likely to fall on the side of physical kind of responsibility, so to speak. So we need to be talking about what we're doing in our day-to-day, and then they will take that information, and then any positives you add about yourself or any things that you're working towards will be a benefit. What I would say on that, there is a part of that that is important. If we haven't done something, don't worry too much if you're not an expert, for example, but I would potentially include somewhere in your CV, in your cover letter, what you're hoping to learn is what I would say to that. Because
working towards, and
it's very rare that you're going to find someone for a role that's done everything, because more often than not, that person's not going to want the job. So that kind of level of aspiration, I think, is really important. I think that's a really good question.
Okay. Great stuff. If you've got any questions for Laura, do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We've got a couple coming in. So are you okay to take a few of these, Laura?
Absolutely fine. So how detailed should education be if a CV is for an older but very experienced in senior role candidate? Good question. I think education is still relevant, but of course, potentially less so over the course of your career. So if you're applying to your first role outside of university, to make a comparison, or first role after completing a professional qualification, perhaps your GCSEs might be really important. But by the time you've developed in your career, less detail is probably what I see more of, if I'm honest with you. So if there are bigger elements, if there's a professional qualification that you need to show, a university degree, or kind of some level of attainment, by all means add it. But too much detail, I wouldn't worry too much on that, because ultimately your CV is going to do the talking, if that makes sense with you. So I hope that one was helpful. Okay. Could you kindly elaborate on what you meant by not telling off with one CV? I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean by that. Can I ask you to type a bit more information? I did a lot of talking. So if you can elaborate on that one, that would be super helpful. And then I'll come back to you.
We've had an interesting one in the chat box as well. It's what we're saying here. Someone says an avid clay shooter. Would hobbies that involve firearms put employers off?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that would be absolutely fine. It's definitely a safe activity to be doing. If you're robbing banks, don't add it. But I think for the sake of that, I think that's an interesting hobby that not many people do. So definitely add that one, I think.
Okay. And another one is, please can you tell me if you should include references?
References, some people will add references available on request, but ultimately, referencing is such a core part of any company's recruitment process. We all need it nowadays. So it's assumed that you'd release your references. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But when it comes to your references, you do need to be able, when you're further along in the process, you need to be able to produce them, is really what I would say. You can add available on request if you want to, but bar that, you're okay.
Great stuff.
Okay, I've got one in the Q&A box here. Is it proper to include in your CV while undergoing a training program while applying for a job? So I think maybe what you mean by that is if you're in a role where you're being trained, should you add that to your CV? Absolutely, yes. I think it really does benefit and allows an employer to paint a better picture of you. And don't worry too much about, and I know a lot of people have that angst thinking, oh no, what happens if my employer finds out? It really just doesn't happen. There's that kind of assumed confidentiality with a job search. So I would definitely add that. And in your cover letter, mark the reasons as to why. And then hopefully you filled in any gaps that might potentially be missing or someone might infer something from when they're going through your CV. So hopefully that helps you. Okay. In the world of emails, is it necessary to attach a letter, or will the letter content suffice within the email? Good question. I would say err on the side of caution with that one, Andy, and I would add it either as two separate documents to the email, or I would add your cover letter and CV as one document. But I would assume that the person receiving that email, if they're not the hiring manager themselves, they're going to forward it on. And at some point, that content of your email is going to get lost somewhere along the line. So I'd probably send it as an attachment, is what I would say to that one. Okay. Ryan's asked, how can we make the most from the first 6 seconds? That's a tough one. I would say it's going to be your key skills. It's going to be pulling all of that information out. It's going to be a clear and concise personal profile or professional overview. And it's going to be the order and the prioritization piece that we spoke about earlier, just to make sure that the right information is coming first. We don't want all the good bits to be on the back end of page 2. We want it to be right at the start. Okay, question here. Should volunteer experience be classed as part of experience history or under a separate heading? So Faith, I think for that one, if your volunteering was a volunteer role and it took up what you'd kind of class as a paid role, so to speak, if it can count as that, if you were volunteering for a longer period of time, I would add it to your professional experience, your kind of full length chronology. Otherwise, I would do it as a separate part, and then that allows you perhaps a bit more space to write about it too. But that's a really good question. Okay. Should you include your date of birth? No, it's not relevant at all, and nobody should be hiring based on any of those, credentials, your age, your sex, your background, anything like that at all. It's not allowed that people hire on that basis. So don't worry about adding it at all. I'd actually remove it, is what I would say to that one. Okay.
And there's one more that's come up in the chat box, Laura. Can you please tell me more about being searchable? Does this mean if I enter my name on Google, what would I come up in, I guess? Or is this just for LinkedIn?
Right, I see what you mean. So what I mean by that is if you're on a job board, so if you've put your CV up to any kind of job board platform, there will be a big umbrella and a big kind of room, so to speak, of CVs. And unless somebody types in the right information using search terms, you'll just stay in that big pool. So I mean searchability from that sense. And then LinkedIn as well. So in your kind of your bio, in your responsibilities that you can put under your current role, you can attach a CV to your LinkedIn. That's the other side of it as well. So that's what I mean by searchability. But Google-wise, it's an interesting point to touch on. Just be careful with your social media is probably what I would say with that. So make sure we're not too open and we're not showing things we don't want our employer to see. But that's kind of a general rule anyway. We don't want the world seeing our, that's not what social media is for. It's for all our good bits, isn't it?
Okay, and I think we're probably coming up to the end of the session now, but we've got one more question, one or two more questions here. Should we include a photo? That's a good one.
It is a good question, and it's very common. I wouldn't, because once again, it's kind of encouraging that sense of bias that we're removing from the job application process. So don't do that, I would say, because not everyone will, first off, and second off, there's no reason why they should be assessing you at all on that basis. So I wouldn't.
Okay, and I think we've got the last one here. So if you add in a link on your CV, i.e. to LinkedIn, does it matter if they're not exactly the same, or would you tailor the CV to the job, but not to your CV? So I guess that question is there. I mean, do you tailor your CV and covering letter to the actual job, or do you keep them consistent, I suppose?
Right, I see what you mean. With your LinkedIn, if you're applying to different types of jobs, keep your LinkedIn as the general one. And if you've explained yourself in the cover letter and you've got your motivations and you're applying to something and you've explained why you're applying to it, that's absolutely fine. I'd leave your LinkedIn more general if that is the case, and maybe talk about the now as opposed to your wants, and then we can explain that in the cover letter and maybe further in the CV when we're pulling out our key skills, if that helps you, Adam.
Okay. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Lara, thank you. That's been really, really useful. And really quite daunting as well, some of the more technological sides of it. But it's opened up a new world. You know, most people think they just write a letter and it goes to a person.
Yeah.
That's clearly not the case, is it, anymore? I will encourage you to get in touch with Laura if you want some more information. And if you're interested in membership, just get in touch with us as well. But that is it for tonight. So I'll thank you all for attending and hopefully see you again on another webinar. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Bye.